Human Psychology in Viewing Others' Flaws, a Journey of Self-Awareness. Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic. Why do humans feel they more easily see others' shortcomings than their own? This question seems simple, but it contains complex layers of human psychology. You have probably experienced this. Other people's mistakes appear clearly visible, as if viewed through a magnifying glass, while our own flaws seem obscured, as if hidden in fog. Is this a simple illusion, or is it a psychological phenomenon inherent in all of us? Let's explore together. Chapter 1. The Asymmetry of Human Cognition. Human cognitive structure is fundamentally asymmetrical. This is clearly confirmed from the perspectives of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and evolutionary psychology. We have sensory organs optimized for perceiving the external world. Eyes are directed outward, and ears are designed to hear external sounds. However, there are no dedicated sensory organs for looking at oneself. This asymmetry is not limited to the physical dimension. Psychologically, we use different mechanisms when observing others versus when observing ourselves. Others' behaviors are input to us as objective data, but our own behaviors are processed as information that has already passed through a subjective filter. We could call this a cognitive double standard. Interestingly, we tend to interpret others' actions as issues of their internal tendencies or personality. That person is late because they are lazy. However, in the same situation, we often explain our own actions through environmental factors. I was late because of traffic congestion. In psychology, this is called the fundamental attribution error, attributing others' behaviors to their personality and our own behaviors to external circumstances. This asymmetry partially explains why we are more sensitive to others' flaws. Chapter 2. The Psychology of Projection. Projection, a concept first systematized by Freud, is a key mechanism that explains this phenomenon. Projection is an unconscious defense mechanism where, rather than acknowledging uncomfortable feelings, flaws, or desires within oneself, one projects them onto others. The interesting point here is that the flaws we most sensitively react to in others often correspond to flaws within ourselves. Like looking in a mirror, we discover our own shadows in other people. Think about it. If there's a pattern of behavior in others that particularly bothers you, it might be reflecting an anxiety or weakness within yourself. For example, someone who is particularly critical of others wasting money might be projecting their own financial anxiety or guilt about spending habits. Speaking somewhat cynically, we are performing a kind of psychological garbage disposal by projecting our flaws onto others. In the illusion that I'm fine, the problem is with other people, we miss opportunities for self-reflection. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Self-Justification. Humans are remarkably skilled at self-justification. We construct elaborate narratives to rationalize our actions, thoughts, and feelings. This self-justification plays an important role in reducing cognitive dissonance and protecting self-esteem. Let me give an example. Suppose a colleague reacted sensitively during a meeting at work. We easily judge that colleague as someone who can't control their emotions or someone lacking professionalism. But what if we ourselves reacted sensitively in the same situation? Excuses like, "Today was a particularly stressful day. It was a justified reaction because my opinion was ignored," or "I'm just a principled person," would immediately come to mind. Interestingly, this self-justification process happens almost automatically. It's as if we have an internal lawyer who creates logic to defend our actions 24 hours a day. In contrast, for others' actions, there is no such lawyer to consider context and background. There is only a judge who makes immediate judgments. This cognitive asymmetry causes us to understand our own actions within a complex context, while framing others' actions in simplified terms. As a result, others' flaws seem obvious, but our own flaws are perceived as special circumstances or unavoidable choices. Chapter 4: Social Comparison and the Dynamics of Self-Esteem. Humans inherently tend to evaluate their worth through social comparison. According to Festinger's social comparison theory, we constantly compare ourselves with others to evaluate our opinions and abilities. In this comparison process, discovering others' flaws provides a kind of psychological sense of victory. The thought, "at least I don't do that," has the effect of temporarily boosting our self-esteem. This is especially pronounced in situations of anxiety or self-doubt. For example, a student anxious about academic achievement may react more sensitively to other students' small mistakes or deficiencies. An employee anxious about their abilities in the workplace may tend to perceive and remember colleagues' mistakes more significantly. Looking at this phenomenon somewhat cynically, we are getting a cheap self-esteem boost through others' flaws. This strategy of elevating oneself by diminishing others may be effective in the short term, but in the long run, it hinders genuine self-growth and the formation of mutually respectful relationships. Chapter 5: Availability, Bias and Selective Perception. In cognitive psychology, availability bias refers to the tendency to place greater weight on information that can be easily recalled. We spend much more time observing others than ourselves. We experience our inner selves 24 hours a day, but it is very difficult to observe this objectively. In contrast, others' behaviors are directly observable from the outside, and negative behaviors in particular are remembered more vividly. This is related to another cognitive bias called negativity bias. Our brains have evolved to respond more sensitively to negative information than positive information. What happens when these two biases combine? We pay more attention to others' negative traits or behaviors and remember them longer. That is, others' flaws become more available information in our cognitive system. For example, suppose you made a mistake once during a presentation. Most of the audience may clearly remember only that one mistake. But you yourself remember not only that mistake, but also the process of staying up all night to prepare, the effort to overcome nervousness, and the parts that went well during the rest of the time. Thus, others' actions tend to be perceived fragmentarily, while our own actions are perceived within a holistic context. Chapter 6: The Limits of Empathy and the Difficulty of Perspective Taking. Humans cannot perfectly understand others' mental states. This is our cognitive limitation. According to neuroscientific research, the empathy neural network that is activated when we try to understand others' emotions or intentions, and the neural network that monitors our own state, use different brain regions. Taking another's perspective, or perspective taking, is a cognitively complex process. We must temporarily suspend our current knowledge, emotional state, and belief system, and imagine another person's psychological state. This requires considerable mental energy and conscious effort. Therefore, we often rely on projective understanding, interpreting others' actions from our own perspective. We try to understand others through questions like, "What would my intention be if I did that?" This, of course, greatly increases the possibility of misunderstanding. Somewhat pessimistically, we are each trapped in our own reality bubble, and it is impossible to fully enter another person's bubble. What we can see is always the image of others that has passed through our own cognitive filters. These limits of empathy prevent us from considering sufficient context when judging others. As a result, others' actions are often simplified and sometimes distorted in perception. Chapter 7: An Evolutionary Psychology Perspective. The Adaptive Value of Flaw Detection. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, the ability to sensitively detect others' flaws likely helped with survival and reproduction in primitive environments. For our ancestors, accurately assessing the reliability, willingness to cooperate, and potential danger of other group members was very important. Especially, missing negative traits or behaviors could lead to fatal consequences. Failure to identify traitors or parasites could result in loss of resources or even life-threatening situations. In this context, hypersensitivity to others' flaws may be due to a kind of detection cost asymmetry. In other words, the cost of a false positive error detecting a non-existent threat was much less than the cost of a false negative error failing to detect an actual threat. From this evolutionary perspective, our sensitivity to others' flaws may have been a kind of useful bias. However, in modern society, this bias can lead to unnecessary interpersonal conflicts and misunderstandings. Cynically speaking, we are trying to solve 21st century social challenges with Stone Age software. This ancient psychological mechanism of detecting others' flaws too sensitively can often be maladaptive in the complex social contexts of today. Chapter 8: The Influence of Cultural Context and Socialization Process. So far, we have mainly discussed universal cognitive mechanisms. However, sensitivity to others' flaws and insensitivity to self-flaws show considerable differences depending on cultural context. For example, there are differences in the degree of self-enhancement bias between collectivistic and individualistic cultures. In Western individualistic cultures, there is a stronger tendency to evaluate oneself positively and consider oneself superior to others. In contrast, a self-critical perspective is more prominent in East Asian collectivistic cultures. These cultural differences are related to different ways of constructing the self: independent self-construal and interdependent self-construal. In independent self-construal, individual uniqueness and autonomy are emphasized, while in interdependent self-construal, relationality and social harmony are more valued. Also, family environment and early socialization processes have significant influences. People who grew up in excessively critical environments may be more sensitive to others' evaluations and may more easily find others' flaws to defend their own worth. Interestingly, despite these cultural and developmental influences, the basic tendency to be more sensitive to others' flaws is observed globally. This suggests that the cognitive and evolutionary mechanisms discussed earlier are part of universal human experience. Chapter 9: The Journey of Self-Awareness and Practical Wisdom. So far, we have explored various psychological, cognitive, and cultural mechanisms for why humans more easily see others' flaws than their own shortcomings. Now, the important question is, what should we do? Self-awareness is a lifelong journey. It may be impossible to completely overcome our cognitive biases, but we can recognize their existence and strive to minimize their impact. The first step is humility. It is important to acknowledge that we are all beings with cognitive limitations. Our judgments are always imperfect, and the impressions we form about others are often fragmentary and distorted. The second step is curiosity. Rather than immediate judgment of others' behaviors, it is important to have genuine interest in the context and background of that behavior. Questions like, why did this person act this way? What situational factors influenced them? Logically, what difficulties might they be experiencing that I don't know about? Broaden our perspective. The third step is self-reflection. When others' flaws particularly bother us, it can be beneficial to examine whether they reflect something within ourselves. It could be a form of projection, or something that touches on our own anxieties or fears. Finally, the practice of empathy and compassion. We are all imperfect beings, wrestling with life's challenges in our own ways. When we discover others' flaws, it can be helpful to view them as expressions of common humanity rather than as objects of blame. Somewhat paradoxically, the more deeply we acknowledge our own flaws and vulnerabilities, the more understanding and generous we can be towards others' flaws. Self-acceptance leads to acceptance of others. Chapter 10. Conclusion. Under the light of biblical wisdom. As we conclude our journey, it is very meaningful to examine biblical wisdom on this topic. Interestingly, this psychological tendency of humans is already insightfully recorded in the Bible thousands of years ago. In Matthew 7:3-5, Jesus says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." This metaphor perfectly captures the psychological phenomenon we have been examining. We easily notice others' small flaws, the specks, but are often blind to our own larger flaws, the planks. The Bible also repeatedly emphasizes the importance of self-reflection and humility. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." An attitude of judging others without acknowledging one's own flaws is a kind of pride which hinders spiritual and psychological growth. Furthermore, the Bible also provides warnings about judging others. In Romans 2:1, Paul writes, "You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." These biblical teachings align remarkably with modern psychological discoveries. Focusing on others' flaws is often a form of self-deception and self-justification. True wisdom and maturity begin with humbly acknowledging one's own flaws and extending grace and understanding to others. The Bible's teachings also offer us a solution. Galatians 6:1 advises, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted." This verse teaches the right attitude when dealing with others' flaws. First, approach with a gentle spirit. Second, a self-reflective attitude of watching yourself is necessary. Third, it is important to have a humble recognition that we all share the same human vulnerabilities. Ultimately, biblical wisdom not only provides deep understanding of the psychological mechanisms we have explored, but also offers spiritual and ethical guidance beyond them. Paying attention to one's own shortcomings before others' flaws, and having an attitude of understanding and compassion rather than judgment, is the essence of true wisdom that the Bible teaches us. The teaching in Matthew 22:39, "Love your neighbor as yourself," is not just a moral command, but contains practical wisdom for overcoming our cognitive biases. Loving others as oneself means applying the same generosity and understanding to others that we bestow upon ourselves. Biblical teachings penetrate the complex layers of human psychology and point the way beyond them. That we are more sensitive to others' flaws is a universal human tendency, but recognizing and transcending it is our choice. And in that journey of choice, biblical wisdom becomes our most reliable compass. Thank you sincerely for listening to this audiobook for a long time. I hope that our exploration today of human psychology in viewing others' flaws has been a small help in your self-awareness and interpersonal relationships. Understanding the complex mechanisms of human psychology is the first step to understanding and accepting yourself and others more deeply. None of us is perfect, and we are all walking a journey of growth and learning in our own ways. I would like to continue exploring more psychological, philosophical, and spiritual topics with you in the future. By subscribing to this channel, you can regularly receive new audiobooks and content. Also, your valuable opinions and suggestions for topics you would like covered in the future will be of great help if left in the comments. Thank you again for your continued interest and support, and I look forward to meeting you in the next audiobook. Have a peaceful and blessed day.